Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Rory O'Toole. We've got quite the show for you guys today. We're going to be discussing best and worst of the week. Going to get into a little segment of story of a song before getting into another edition of Classic Album of the Week, and then finishing off with a tribute to Eddie Van Halen, who passed away at the age of 65 this week. So, plenty to talk about, plenty to run through. Music's always going. The music wheel keeps on turning, and we always got something to talk about. So, let's just get into it, y'all. So, to start things off, whenever we do the best and the worst of the week segment, I like to hit the worst first. I'm a guy who likes to hear the bad news before the good news. So, let's just start with the worst of the week here. Machine Gun Kelly's Tickets to My Downfall. This is the new album from the former rapper from Cleveland, Ohio. He's been a rapper for about a decade now, but he's gone towards the pop-punk direction. Clearly a big Blink-182 fan here, as he had Travis Barker, the drummer of Blink-182, executive produce this album. And it's been quite the success commercially for Machine Gun Kelly. It has earned his first number one on the Billboard Hot 100. Earned 126,000 equivalent album units per Billboard. Now commercially it's doing really, really well. Machine Gun Kelly sells a lot of records in general. He has a big fan base. He's a big name. But, when artists go in a brand new direction like this, where you totally switching genres, sometimes the fans don't follow you. But looks like the fans are following Machine Gun Kelly to this pop-punk land. And simultaneously, he's picking up some new fans who maybe weren't into his rap stuff, but really are digging his pop-punk sound here. In any event, it has, shot to the top of the charts in America. Now, critically, it's a bit more mixed. Some, like Pitchfork, have actually given it a decent rating and said it was fine. It wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. It had some good moments. While, other figures like The Needle Drop on YouTube totally disparaged the record. I think The Needle Drop actually had like a 2-minute video. Just usually his are 15 minutes, so when it's 2 minutes, he really hated it, and hated it he did. Now, I'm more in the Melon camp here. The Needle Drop camp, if you don't know the Melon reference. And, we have our disagreements quite often, but I think he's right on the mark here where he called it generic and repetitive and not punk and not challenging and just very paint by the numbers sort of pop punk. And I have to agree. I didn't find anything that innovative, that exciting, or frankly, that thrilling with this. And maybe that's being unfair to Machine Gun Kelly. This is his first time, his first foray into the pop punk universe. And I'm not saying he's a bad singer or that the singing itself is god awful. It's not. Like, the guy has some talent, and I could see why people would catch on to these songs that are, you know, very fun to listen to, a bit earwormy, a bit catchy. I can see the appeal. I just think if it wasn't Machine Gun Kelly doing it, would this be as big a record as it is? And I don't think so, because it is quite generic, very repetitive. There's really no originality here. And to me, that's I don't appreciate when a piece of music or art is appreciated not because of the content, but just simply because of the person. And that's driving the bias towards it. And that's sort of what this feels. If you didn't know it was Machine Gun Kelly and you just said this is a random pop punk band, maybe it'd be successful, but would it be number one in the country? Probably not. Now, to get into the granular criticisms here, the cover art is the first thing that greets you when you listen to this record. So we have a picture of Machine Gun Kelly standing in front of an empty pool with a disheveled but impetuous look. And we have a literal Anarchy A in the writing of Tickets to My Downfall, in with the letter A in that. It's the Anarchy symbol, which is about the lamest, most suburban idea of what punk rock is. What anarchy, like, it really is just another example of people co-opting symbols like that and having no idea what they mean, but just, oh, it looks cool. This is what they put in Hot Topic. That's sort of the feeling you get looking at that. And he's got bleached hair and a mushroom top. He's got on Chuck Taylors, ripped jeans, and a Walt chain down there somewhere. So really, the image that you're getting is the music that you're getting as well. So, you know, sort of the Hot Topic version of pop punk. Someone who is very self-consciously aware and trying to be punk, which, you know, really the punk ethos is about just being yourself, unapologetically yourself. So you're already showing a fundamental misunderstanding of what punk should be. And like I said, in this case, you can judge a book by its cover. This album indeed sounds like a Hot Topic located in an anonymous suburb. The new MGK has the emotional maturity of a 15-year-old who thinks stealing his mom's credit card and scoring some weed or pills makes him a rebellious nonconformist instead of the brain-dead parasitic consumer he really is. A suburban white kid angry at everything but roused by nothing besides his own blind desires and ego. Machine Gun Kelly is attempting to sell himself as a punk rocker despite the whole complicated reality that part of being a punk rocker, at least in theory, is not selling yourself as one. So, those are really my main takeaways of the album. But just to backtrack a little, once upon a time, Machine Gun Kelly, he was a semi-famous white rapper. Spazzy, technical, menacing in a try-hard fashion that befits a man who named himself after an infamous gangster from Prohibition. He had a hit with the 2016 Camila Cabello collab Bad Things, which made it to number 4 on the charts. But probably his greatest moment of relevancy happened a couple years ago when he got into an entertaining feud with his inspiration, Eminem. He memorably called Eminem's beard weird and had a whole weird thing with Eminem's daughter. It was dominating YouTube discourse for about a week there. And he's even made film cameos in two of his buddy Pete Davidson's films, King of Staten Island and Big Time Adolescence, which I really enjoyed. I think he was good in those films. At some point, MGK decided his rap career wasn't where he wanted to be and decided on the Kid Rock route, pivoting from the mic to the guitar, from the cypher killer to the pop punk's angst-driven sound, popularized by acts like Blink-182 and the Vans Warped Tour. Whether it was his label or MGK himself, one or the other, both identified that he needed to do was hop on the emerging emo rap wave, popularized by artists like Juice WRLD and Lil Peep, that had embraced much of pop punk's aesthetic and attitude, but fully lean into becoming a viable rock musician instead of just a rapper. And that's how you get an album that's generic and with vocals that feel like an attempt at pop punk instead of it coming naturally. That being said, I can see why some people like it, but if you're actually familiar with pop punk, you can see how it's unoriginal and wrong-headed. That is my worst of the week, but certainly Machine Gun Kelly's having a good week for himself. He's happily in love with Megan Fox and has the #1 record in America. That's a pretty good timeline for Machine Gun Kelly. My best of the week is Mariah Carey's memoir, and not because Mariah Carey is a favorite of mine or because the book is particularly well written, but it's just the best of the week, just what the little snippets we have gotten from this book and Mariah Carey entering back into our lives. She is, of course, not only a great singer, but constantly in the tabloids, constantly stirring up drama, spilling tea, and that is what she brings to the table here. But just to give you a little sense of her resume, just to put it in perspective, she is the top-selling female artist of the 1990s and third best-selling female artist of all time at 200 million records. She has the most #1 songs of any solo artist and the second most of all time behind the Beatles. She passed Elvis Presley a few years ago. That being said, she is not really well known personally. She's always had her public-facing image, but we haven't got a sense of who Mariah Carey, the person, is. Her cartoonishly glamorous lifestyle makes her easy to mock, but she is self-aware enough to facilitate it and play along. And that's sort of what we get in the book here. But more than that, we get some really honest appraisals of her upbringing and her racial dynamics as a biracial person and singer in the music industry. And it's really fascinating. Even if you don't like Mariah Carey, I think it's a great glimpse into pop stardom of the 90s and 2000s and just the racial dynamics that play into that as well, and just the dynamics of celebrity and living your life through the tabloids. Now, her plan, unsurprisingly, was to always make it in music. Quote, "I cried on my 18th birthday. I thought I was a failure because I didn't have a record deal yet." So clearly she was very ambitious and driven from the start. As a teenager, she would travel from Long Island into Manhattan for weeknight recording sessions and just commute back and forth from Long Island to the city. She said she had no backup plan, no safety net. Music was the only plan ever, she wrote. And much of that was a way to escape her abusive household. The singer shared some really heart-wrenching moments. She describes when she was 12 years old, her sister drugged her with Valium, offered her a pinky nail full of cocaine, inflicted her with third-degree burns after throwing tea on her, and tried to sell her out as a pimp at one point. As soon as Carey made it in the music industry, they treated her like an ATM and even tried to institutionalize her while getting the rights to all her recordings. So, pretty dark family dynamic there. She also entered into a very controlling marriage with the head of Sony Music, Tommy Mottola. He actually signed her and was sort of responsible for her getting her start. He was 20 years older than her and quite possessive and controlling, according to Carrie. Sometimes she would go to snack downstairs or to write some lyrics or enjoy a moment to herself, and he would randomly get on the intercom and ask, "What you doing?" So really, it was like she was being spied on all the time. And yeah, eventually she got out of that marriage, but it was really dark and controlling. And Derek Jeter, the captain, the famous shortstop from the New York Yankees, was the catalyst for her to end her first marriage, as they had a steamy affair at one point. I think it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. She said Derek was the second person I'd slept with ever. Just like his position on the team, our relationship was a short stop in my life. That's clever. But she goes on, he was the catalyst I needed to get out from under Tommy's crippling control and get in touch with my sensuality. And the intimacy of our shared racial experience was major. To connect with a healthy family who looked like mine was very inspiring. Of course, both Carrie and Derek Jeter both had Irish mothers with black fathers, so that's sort of where that bond came from. And yeah, Derek Jeter. That man has had his tentacles in lots of celebrity romantic flings. And yeah, it's really interesting book on her career, but more just getting a sense of who Mariah Carey the person was, because we've never really had that before. And she's still a diva, but now you get to understand where the diva comes from and where it's rooted in. Two more pieces of best and worst of the week. Another aspect that was really great this week was Mick Fleetwood's TikTok. Now, of course, last month a video from the TikTok user 420dogface208 went viral. In the video, Idaho skateboarder Nathan Apodaca rides around on his board while drinking cranberry juice and vibing out to Fleetwood Mac's Dreams. And the sales of Dreams nearly tripled following the clip. Mick Fleetwood paid tribute by filming himself skateboarding and recreating the whole scene, drinking the juice. Since then, a representative from Ocean Spray showed up at Apodaca's trailer in Idaho to drop off a truckload of cranberry juice and the truck. So, really heartwarming story there. Mick Fleetwood, totally loving it. And it's just, that was a nice moment from this week. And to round things off, another worst of the week candidate, J Balvin's McDonald's meal. We discussed this extensively in regards to Travis Scott. Now J Balvin is getting on the McDonald's sponsored meal business. So Travis Scott got his own meal called the Cactus Jack meal. Now J Balvin has his own. It's a Big Mac, medium fries with an Oreo McFlurry. It's based on the idea that you're getting an up-close and personal experience with celebrities by ordering and eating the exact same food as they do. Clearly a marketing ploy. Clearly just an attempt to, drive business towards McDonald's. Has nothing to do with music. Pretty lame. And just blanket commercialization is not really what gets any of us into music. So that is my best and worst of the week. After the break, we're going to get into Story of a Song, the 1980s super hit. Still has a legacy today, both as a song that's loved and a song that's hated. We Are the World.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Welcome back to the show. Just got through another edition of Best and Worst of the Week. Lots to cover there. Now, it's time for Story of a Song. We've done a few entries of these. Always a lot of fun. Get to unearth the story behind some of the most iconic songs. And generally I've chosen songs that I like, but I thought, this one, let's go with the song that I don't necessarily like, but is one that's iconic or memorable or infamous or just has a large legacy, casts a long shadow over the music world for whatever reason. And I thought, what better than We Are the World, which is a song everyone knows. Famously has Michael Jackson, has Diana Ross, has Kenny Rogers, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Cyndi Lauper. Has a whole all-star cast of people. Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles. But isn't a song that I think a lot of people listen to out of pleasure all that often? I don't think it's a song that's in anyone's favorite songs of all time list. But it is one of the highest selling songs of all time and one of the most memorable songs of all time for all the reasons we're going to get into. So I thought, you know what, that's one worth looking at, one worth exploring. So officially by the USA for Africa Coalition, it was a hit. Reached number one status on April 13th, 1985, and it stayed at number one for 4 weeks. The song would become America's greatest moment of musical magnanimity, selling 20 million copies. The single raised more than $63 million for aid in the U.S. and Africa, where famine in Ethiopia would claim 1.2 million lives between 1983 and 1985. In the earliest days of the single, We Are the World set in an unmatchable bar. No greater collection of superstar artists had ever congregated in the same studio, and we have not seen it since. Tons of people on We Are the World. This abundance was basically the selling point for the song. That and whatever guilt relief that buyers earned when they spent a few bucks on this 7-minute song. Now, as far as the history of these charity-driven songs, we can sort of zero in to 1984 in the United Kingdom, where a supergroup of mostly British singers was put together to record a song, Do They Know It's Christmas? The single, released under the name Band-Aid, was to raise money for Ethiopian famine relief as well. Sold 3 million copies in the United Kingdom alone. For years, it was the biggest selling single in UK history. In the US, it peaked at number 13. Around the same time, the entertainment industry legend Harry Belafonte wanted to put together a big benefit concert for the famine as well. And so a couple days before Christmas in 1984, Belafonte called up Ken Cragen, who was a high-powered manager at the time, who suggested that they try to come up with an all-star single of their own, like Do They Know It's Christmas? So Cragen liked the idea, and he called up his clients Kenny Rogers and Lionel Richie first. Then he got Quincy Jones to agree to produce it. And once you get Lionel Richie, Kenny Rogers, Quincy Jones, those are 3 very famous, legendary figures in their own right, especially in the 80s. They had a lot of power. So once those people were locked in, it was kind of a avalanche of just talent signing up. So Michael Jackson does the song after Quincy Jones reaches out to him. Of course, Quincy Jones is sort of responsible for Michael Jackson's success as a solo artist. And they also get Stevie Wonder to sign up. So once that happens, Richie and Jackson get together to write the song. And they did it at Jackson's family's house in Encino. Stevie Wonder was busy. That's why he didn't participate in the writing sessions. And so they spent about a week trying to make the song as simple and memorable as possible. Richie told Billboard that the pair would listen to national anthems to get a feel for the enormity of the song. When they weren't being interrupted by unexpected intruders, quote, "I'm on the floor in Michael's bedroom," he said. "I don't think he had a bed. He had just slept on the floor. There's a bunch of albums around the wall, and I hear over my shoulder, 'There's a blank python, a boa constrictor, a python who scares the hell out of me. It was a big, ugly snake. I was screaming, and Michael saying, 'There he is, Lionel, we found him. He was hiding behind the albums.' I said, 'You're out of your mind.' It took me about 2 hours to calm back down." So, yeah, Michael Jackson, always one for weird and wild pets, had his own pet boa constrictor, and it freaked Lionel Richie out while they're writing the song. Eventually, they get over it. And Jackson surprises both Richie and Quincy Jones with a demo for the track that he'd recorded in a single night. Meanwhile, Cragen worked his way down the Hot 100, calling everyone he could find and trying to get them to agree to the project. Cragen had the idea to record the song on the same night as the American Music Awards, which were going down in Los Angeles at the end of January. That meant there'd be a ton of stars who'd be in LA all at the same time. But it also meant that Cragen only had a month to get everything together. His two white whales were Bruce Springsteen and Prince. After badgering Springsteen's manager, Springsteen eventually agreed, but Prince thought the whole thing was stupid. He couldn't see how his voice would work in this all-star cacophony. And they really reached out. They tried to get him, but he went out partying in LA that night instead, which disappointed Quincy Jones, who had planned on having Prince participate, because obviously Michael Jackson and Prince had this huge rivalry in the 80s, and it would have been really cool to get them singing on the same song. Apparently they were supposed to overlap lines or go one after the other, which would have been a really cool moment, but Prince was like, "Yeah, that's not for me," which, knowing Prince, makes some sense. And so they replaced Prince with Huey Lewis, which is a peak 80s move right there. When the stars arrived at the studio the night for recording, they were famously met by a sign that told them to check their egos at the door. And Quincy Jones is probably the only producer who had enough clout to get all these stars to shut up and work together as a team, because he's such a legend already by that point. And that's what you need when you have all those egos, all those stars in one place. You're going to have some conflict, so you need a figure like Quincy Jones to get everyone to be on the same wavelength. And who really brought the house down was Ray Charles when he arrived. Billy Joel, who's also on the song, exclaimed, "That's like the Statue of Liberty walking in," and was visibly shaking when Quincy Jones introduced him to Ray Charles. And they spent much of the night with Billy Joel, Waylon Jennings, and Willie Nelson drinking when they weren't singing, which is fantastic. Michael Jackson apparently hid in the bathroom during part of the recording. Bob Dylan was very nervous, according to some of the people who were present that night. The unusual nasal sound of Dylan's voice was what made him so iconic, but in that room of recognizable, powerful voices, he appeared nervous and unsure. So Jones had to talk him through his solo, kept encouraging him. Eventually, he even cleared out the room, so it was just Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder, and him. And they finally got a good take. But as the session crept into the early hours, because, something like this takes a long time, we did see some frictions develop. Billy Joel said, I don't think anybody liked it. There was a lot of, side-eye. There was a lot of looking at the other person, and I remember Cyndi Lauper saying, it sounds like a Pepsi commercial. There was a couple of chuckles and a few grunts. That was pretty much the consensus, I think. But nobody was going to say, I'm not doing that. At 1 a.m., an argument broke out over a nonsense lyric Jackson had included at the end of the chorus. Shalalam, shalalinge. Now, if you know Michael Jackson, he's, famous for saying absolute gibberish, but making it sound amazing. Geldof, though, argued that it sounded too close to an African language and that it might be considered mocking. So Stevie Wonder called the Nigerian friend to get a phrase in Swahili that would be appropriate for the song. The phrase was Willy Moingu, which didn't go down well with some of the cast. Ray Charles apparently yelled, say what? Willy what? Willy Mongoom? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I can't get even singing in English no more. Geldof pointed out that Ethiopians don't speak Swahili anyways, and Waylon Jennings left the sessions claiming no good old boy sings a Swahili. When everyone voted to settle on the new line, one word, our children, an exhausted Tina Turner muttered, I like Shalalam better, who cares what it means? So, just like any school project or, any large group of human beings, when it's late at night and you're arguing over little things like that, people are going to start losing their cool. Start flying off the handles. With the chorus in the can by 3 a.m., quite the long night, Ray Charles also departed, declaring, I haven't had no good lovin' since January. Keep in mind, it was January. Iconic line from Ray Charles there. USA for Africa took an hour break. Everyone said about collecting all the other artists' signature on their music charts. People were gracious and wonderful about that, says Kim Carnes. Nobody held back. Everybody wanted to get everybody's signature. Everyone knew it was a really special night. It's almost like signing people's yearbooks. It's kind of cute that all these stars kind of fangirled over each other. Now, the song, of course, was a massive, huge hit. Took over the radio, took over the world, and did raise a lot of money for Ethiopia, and was just a really cool moment for the music world in the 1980s, getting everybody on this track, and was, you could say the height of Michael Jackson's influence on the culture. Showed just Michael Jackson's presence, what he could engender amongst the music community. It was like, Michael Jackson wants everyone to do this, well then we're gonna get everyone who's massive. All the superstars are gonna sign up to do it. That's how powerful and big he was at the moment. Song wise, let's be honest, it's kind of a tough hang. It's a 7-minute kind of awkward starting and stopping sort of rhythm. You have the problem with it is you have all these stars who, most of them aren't even lucky enough to get solos. Most of them are backup singers. But let's say you are lucky enough, you're on the A team, you get an actual solo. You only get a sentence or two, so they put everything they have into singing every line. But when you have people going all out on every single line, there's no flow, there's no chemistry there. It's just kind of, shoehorned and forced, and it doesn't come off as that great musically. And, some of the singers sound pretty great. Cyndi Laupur, really, really takes the most of her line. And Jackson himself, who has the chorus, and I believe the first line, is really, really great. But others like Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen sound just out of place on this. Mostly it's just kind of this mismatched mess, a big group of people who don't have any chemistry with one another and who aren't entirely sure why they're there. The song is, a great idea, but in practice just doesn't come off all that well. And, it's not great music as purely music. If you like the song, you like it because of the story, the people on it, the cultural significance, all this sort of external factors, all those variables sort of make it memorable and worth talking about. But as pure just music, as just a song, I don't think, it's the best. And its legacy has lived on for a long time. Here we are talking about it. And in 2010, after the earthquake in Haiti, they had a remake of the song by another all-star cast, which was titled We Are the World 25 for Haiti. And it was not great. Not a good song. In March 2020, Lionel Richie suggested that a third remake should be made to communicate a message of global solidarity during the COVID pandemic and raise funds for aid effort, but that got kind of nixed. But We Are the World was the height of charity songs and just a really great cultural snapshot of the 1980s and who was on the A-team, who mattered. Apart from maybe Madonna and Prince, basically everyone who defined the 1980s mainstream music scene was there, which is really cool. But the song itself, not the greatest, but, great stories, just really interesting background on how that whole thing came together. After the break, we will be getting into Classic Album of the Week, The Velvet Underground's debut album, The Velvet Underground, and Nico.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the show. We have gotten through best and worst of the week. Story of a song. We're talking about We Are the World. Involved boa constrictors. Involved Ray Charles discussing his sex life. Involved Bob Dylan getting nervous. Crazy story. Very interesting. Very fascinating. And now we're getting to Classic Album of the Week. And again, we are going to finish off with an Eddie Van Halen retrospective. But Classic Album of the Week, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite bands of all time, one of my favorite records of all time. Just absolutely adore this album, adore this band. The Velvet Underground's debut album. Yes, the one with the banana, The Velvet Underground and Nico. It's the debut album by Velvet Underground and German singer Nico, released in March of 1967 by Verve Records. It was recorded in 1966 while the band were featured on Andy Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable tour. Fantastic title there. Very Andy Warhol-esque. And if you don't know why that's Andy Warhol-esque, you're going to learn. We're going to discuss who Andy Warhol is. I assume you probably recognize the name, though. The album features experimental performance sensibilities and controversial lyrical topics, including drug abuse, prostitution, sadomasochism, and sexual deviancy. It sold poorly and was mostly ignored by contemporary critics, but later became regarded as one of the most influential albums in the history of popular music. Many subgenres of rock music and forms of alternative music were informed by the album, including art rock, punk, garage, shoegaze, goth, and indie. The Velvet Underground and Nico was recorded with the first professional lineup of the Velvet Underground: Lou Reed, John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker. At the instigation of their mentor and manager, Andy Warhol, and his collaborator Paul Morrissey, German singer Nika was also featured. She had occasionally performed lead vocals for the band prior, but she was pushed on as a member of the band for this first album and would turn out to be her only full-time appearance with the band. After this album, she would leave the group. And that's basically the basics. As far as who the cast of characters were, Andy Warhol is the founder of what's called pop art, whose paintings and prints of presidents, movie stars, soup cans, and other icons of American culture and celebrity made him one of the most famous artists in the world. In all these endeavors, Mr. Warhol's keenest talents were for attracting publicity, for uttering the unforgettable quote, and for finding the single visual image that would most shock and endure. That his art could attract and maintain the public interest made him among the most influential and widely emulated artists of his time. He's credited with inspiring the widely used expression 15 minutes of fame, which presaged the social media age. Lou Reed originally gained popularity for writing parodies of dance songs like The Ostrich, which became minor hits. Reed was looking for serious poetic expression and rock and roll bands to belong to. He formed the Velvets with John Cale and released several classic projects. He went on to record 20-odd albums, a few of them classics in their own right, along with a dozen or so books of creative writing and poetry. He helped shape the image of the defiant artist, punk chic, razor-edge poetry, and authentic portraits of life, both large and small. John Cale, classically trained Welshman who was ostensibly in America on a student grant to study classical music, but was actually interested in avant-garde moments, good drugs, and American blues. In the streetwise and ambitious Lou Reed, he found his perfect partner. Influenced the sound of the Velvets and was as much behind the avant-garde sensibilities of the group and was the creative heartbeat of the band. Nico, again, German songwriter, musician, model, and actress, released a few good solo projects following her exit from the band. Whether it was a mutual parting of ways or whether she was fired or just pushed out, that's bit up for debate, but basically she was pushed out. The band never wanted her to begin with, but it was, sort of a favor to Andy Warhol. But once they left Andy Warhol following this album, they fired him as manager, and that meant Nico was out of the band as well. But her music career didn't stop then. She went on to have some nice solo projects. And she really inspired a lot of musicians, including The Cure, Morrissey, Elliott Smith, and Bjork. Now, let's get to the story of the making of this album now that we know the cast of characters, who they were, who they'd become. On the advice of confidant Paul Morrissey, the 37-year-old art star Andy Warhol dropped in on the Velvet Underground set at the Cafe Bazaar and impulsively extended an offer to act as their manager. The title was pretty loose as he did not make any alterations to their sound, really. But he did feel like they needed some glamour in order to become stars and get noticed, so he suggested the addition of the striking German model known as Nico. Now, this was not met with that much enthusiasm. Reed was particularly displeased, but she was tentatively accepted into the ranks as a featured vocalist. Now billed as the Velvet Underground with Nico, Warhol incorporated the band into a series of multimedia performances dubbed The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, a marriage of underground music, film, dance, and lights. So, basically any party you've been to if you have any art friends. And also assisting was 27-year-old Norman Dolph, who is an account representative at Columbia Records, who moonlit as a DJ and sound man. He told the author Joe Harvard, "I was an art buff, and my thing was I'd provide the music at art galleries for shows and openings, but I'd ask for a piece of art as payment instead of cash." By the spring of 1966, Warhol decided it was time to take his charges into the recording studio. Knowing little about such matters, he sought out Dolph for advice. When Warhol told me he wanted to make a record with those guys, I said, "Oh, I can take care of that, no problem. I'll do that in exchange for a picture," he said. "I could have said I'd do it in exchange for some kind of finder's fee, but I asked for some artwork, and he was agreeable to that. That's how I met Andy Warhol." The bulk of the songs that would become the Velvet Underground and Nico were recorded in mid-April 1966 during a 4-day stint at Skepter Studios, which was a rundown recording studio in Manhattan. Lou Reed recalled, "It was somewhere between reconstruction and demolition. The walls were falling over, there were gaping holes in the floor, and carpentry equipment littered the place." Cale recalls being similarly underwhelmed in his 1999 autobiography. He said, "The building was on the verge of being condemned. We went in there and found that the floorboards were torn up, the walls were out, there were only 4 mics working." Fun fact, this rundown piece of crap later turned out to be the glamorous Studio 54. So, New York real estate. Crazy. Now, the recording session was financed by Warhol and Columbia Records sales executive Norman Dolph, who also acted as engineer. Though the exact total cost of the project is unknown, estimates vary from what would be around $11,000 today to $23,000 in dollars today. Soon after recording, a disc was sent to Columbia Records in an attempt to interest them, but they declined, as did Atlantic Records and Elektra Records. Atlantic objected to the references to drugs, while Elektra disliked Cale's viola. Finally, the MGM Records owned Verve Records accepted the recordings with the help of producer Tom Wilson. With the backing of the label, 3 of the songs, I'm Waiting for the Man, Venus and Furs, and Heroin, were re-recorded in 2 days at TTG Studios in Hollywood. When the release date was postponed, they went into another studio in Manhattan to add a final song to the track listing, which is the single Sunday Morning. Although Andy Warhol is the only formally credited producer, he had little direct influence beyond paying for the recording sessions. I mean, Andy Warhol didn't know anything about music. They'd just play him something and he'd be like, "Yeah, that sounds fine, whatever." And Reed actually really loved that because he said he just made it possible for us to be ourselves and go right ahead with it because he was Andy Warhol. In a sense, he really did produce it because he was this umbrella that absorbed all the attacks when we weren't large enough to be attacked. And as a consequence of him being the producer, we just walk in and set up and do what we always did, and no one would stop it because Andy was the producer. Of course, he didn't know anything about record production, but he didn't have to. He just sat there and said, "Oh, that's fantastic." And the engineer would say, "Oh, yeah, right, it is fantastic, isn't it?" The 11 songs showcase the Velvet's dynamic range, veering from the pounding attacks of "I'm Waiting for the Man" and "Run, Run, Run," the droning "Venus in Furs and Heroin," the chiming and celestial "Sunday Morning," to the quiet "Femme Fatale" and the tender "I'll Be Your Mirror," as well as Warhol's own favorite song, "All Tomorrow's Parties." The overall sound was propelled by Reed and Nico's deadpan vocals, Cale's drooning viola, bass, and keyboards, Reed's experimental avant-garde guitar, Morrison's often R&B or country-influenced guitar, and Tucker's simple but steady and tribal-sounding beat with sparse use of cymbals. Now, following the release of the record, obviously it didn't do much. It didn't sell well. Critics barely noticed it. And, it made enough to recoup costs, but that was about it. And following its release, Nico moved on after the Velvets severed their relationship with Andy Warhol. Reed once commented that Andy Warhol, sat down and had a talk with me. He said, "You got to decide what you want to do. Do you want to keep just playing museums from now on and art festivals, or do you want to start moving into other areas? Lou, don't you think you should think about it?" So I thought about it, and I fired him, because I thought that was one of the things to do if we were going to move away from that. Now, that pissed Warhol off for years, and their relationship suffered as a result. But he'd later take the high road, both of them, and realize they both contributed something to the other. Now, I think this quote from Consequence of Sound really distills the significance of this album. If the Velvet Underground and Nico taught us anything, it's that perfection in rock and roll is actually the inverse of perfection. There are no golden ratios to be found in Sterling Morrison's spiraling guitar work on Heroin, no sublime sense of symmetry to glean from John Cale's noisy electric viola on Venus in Furs. There's only a vast collection of sounds that shouldn't work but somehow do. To a classically trained ear, a song like Run, Run, Run is disaster masquerading as pop music. Lou Reed's lead guitar lurches left and right with drunken imprecision. Mo Tucker's drums play hide-and-seek inside the fuzzy production, and producer Andy Warhol refuses to step in and color the scheme with even the slightest hint of professionalism. It's messy and chaotic, and prone to sadomasochism in both concept and fact. It's also, 50 years after its initial release, widely considered to be one of the greatest rock and roll albums of all time. It remains the quintessential emblem of a certain brand of countercultural cool. Not the Haight-Ashbury or Sgt. Pepper kind, but an earlier, artier, more NYC-rooted strain. Released in '67, it was an album that brought with it an awareness of the new, the possible, and the darker edge of humanity. Bolstered by the patronage of Andy Warhol and the exotic vocal contributions of Nico, Lou Reed, John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker declared their independence from top 40 decorum with a gritty, innovative, and unapologetically self-possessed work. In many ways, the Velvet Underground and Nico was the first rock album that truly seemed to invite the designation alternative. Now, that's what Rolling Stone wrote. That's what Consequence of Sound wrote. They really, it wasn't a big release when it came out, but as many pieces of art that are brilliant, way ahead of its time. We finally caught up to where the Velvet Underground were in 1967, and it is truly, truly special and genre exploding and just totally defines rock music. It'd be a totally different sound without them. Now, as far as my favorite tracks, run through a few. Sunday Morning, which opens the album, is just gorgeous. You have twinkling chimes, this bass line that's really warm, piano overdubs, and that viola. Written by Reed and Cale on an actual Sunday Morning. The tune was to showcase Nico, but Reed ultimately took the lead vocal. It's just a beautiful tone setter of the wide musical spectrum explored across this album. You could really imagine Taylor Swift or Lana Del Rey swooning on this if you're trying to imagine what it sounds like if you haven't listened to it. I also loved I'm Waiting for the Man, which is a driving, beer-soaked, dirty rock and roll rhythm drive that is really about a gritty tale of buying drugs, and not with any sense of thrill or romanticism, but with an inescapable sense of anxiety and hunger. It shows drug addiction as how it really is, a dirty and messy business, not the idealistic tones in which the hippies of the era championed it. I'll Be Your Mirror, another one, very pretty and simple, folky with the right balance of tenderness and sadness, shows why Nico brought so much to the table here. Venus and Furs is just a droning rhythm with unmistakable goth sensibilities. The lyrics are just as weird as the sound. A perfect representation of their anti-commercial ethos, avant-garde ambitions, and high art inspirations. It's based on an 1870 German novel delivered as a story about a dominatrix. And finally, Heroin, which is, well, about doing heroin, which is really shocking and confessional for an era that was still governed by indecency laws. Its musical reinterpretation of this manic cycle, its dreamy melodic opening, when I put a spike into my vein, I feel like Jesus' son, he sings in the beginning, slowly builds into increasingly chaotic drumming and shrieking guitar until it reaches a crescendo of grinding noise. Heroin Be the Death of Me, Reed sings. It's one of the band's most celebrated tracks for good reason. Launched 1,000 bands, and the one you'd never, under any circumstances, play in front of your parents. In 1982, the musician Brian Eno stated that while the album initially sold only 30,000 copies, everyone who bought one of those 30,000 copies started a band. And that is basically emblematic of what the Velvet Underground represented. It was not immediate success or recognition, but their music and the power of it and the genius of it, the legacy lived on, and those who did listen to it were immediately inspired to make their own art or to get into that scene in any way. And if anything, that's more powerful than if 5 million people buy your record, but, you know, they don't think about it ever again. Also, the album cover is iconic. It's, of course, a drawing of just a simple banana. And like all Andy Warhol work, it's very simple, direct, feels like an advertisement, and it's unforgettable, and it's iconic. It's one of the main symbols of rock and roll. Again, this album showed that alternative music was a viable path. Before this, you either had hits or you didn't. Velvet Underground showed you didn't have to go for hits just to be a successful band. You could tour, you could make money, just enough to survive probably. Maybe you wouldn't be rich, but you'd survive. You'd live as an artist, a real bohemian. You're an alternative. And obviously that's become a very successful form of music in its own right, and they really created the template for it, the blueprint. And Spin Magazine, I think, put it great as well. They said, if your band aspires to be difficult, seeks to force people to confront something, or features an attractive, in a weird way, female vocalist who can't really sing, and therefore sings perfectly, this is why. The Velvet Underground were the first rock band to be artfully abstruse on purpose, defined by as much by John Cale's sonic abrasion as Lou Reed's gutter junk poetry. This album bridged the gap between high and low culture, and it's a bridge countless bookishly sexy rock bands walk to this day. For writing for Grantland, Chuck Klosterman wrote, "This music seems like it could have been recorded last week. Considering that the album is 46 years old, this is mildly amazing. But then you think something else. You know these songs are still weird. The voices are bizarre. The structures are so simple they almost seem awkward. Some of these ideas are crazy. So then you start to wonder how this contradiction could exist. You wonder how something this old could feel so in step with everything that happened in popular culture over the past 46 years, yet still manages to strike the audience as perverse and unorthodox and consumed with self-aware otherness. It makes no sense. Something that sounds this modern should also feel familiar. Something that feels this weird should also sound like it belongs to a different age. But it doesn't sound rote, and it doesn't sound anachronistic. In all likelihood, the most irrefutably timeless rock music anyone has ever made. Not necessarily the best, but the most aesthetically durable. The smartest, all things considered. Also influenced David Bowie, Television, R.E.M., Sonic Youth, the Jesus and Murphy Chain, Pavement, and the Strokes. As much as they could craft beautiful, intricate music, they were much more interested in breaking the rules than following them. Their greatest strength was to lull you into a sense of comfortability before sneaking up on you with experimental, twisted, and forward-thinking songs that this album was the first to showcase of. It's a band and an album that's both challenging and rewarding. They took their patron Andy Warhol's advice that art was about confrontation above all else. And here you're confronted with brilliance. That is it for Classic Album of the Week. After the break, we will be getting into our Eddie Van Halen retrospective.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We're back, and we are finally getting to our Eddie Van Halen tribute, retrospective discussion. Now, usually I like to talk about artists because of the music itself, but sometimes high-profile deaths happen, and though it's very sad and tragic, you know, it does present an opportunity to reflect on the legacy of musicians and sort of put their career into perspective. And, you know, Eddie Van Halen is someone I've been wanting to talk about eventually on the show. Haven't got a chance to yet, but now with his tragic passing at the age of 65 from throat cancer, I thought, you know, now's about the time to sort of get into his legacy and his influence on rock music and popular culture in general. He formed the band with his brother, and they rode a tidal wave of multi-platinum albums over a 15-year period. Few other acts have come close to matching their commercially combustible mixture of spectacular and addictive rock, flamboyant stage performances, and outsized personal behavior. That's how the Washington Post described Van Halen in their obituary. The band sold more than 80 million albums worldwide. 11 of their studio albums reached the US top 10, and 4 reached number 1. In 2012, Van Halen was ranked top of Guitar World magazine's list of 100 greatest guitarists of all time. Now, those are just the facts. So Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Van Halen, one of the most successful bands of the 1980s. And just hugely influential, known again for their personas as much as their music. But as far as the story of how it all started, Jan Van Halen brought his family to Pasadena, California from Amsterdam in 1962. Eddie once commented that they arrived with $50 and a piano. He also said they only spoke 4 words of English: yes, no, motorcycle, and accident. He was a freelance saxophonist and clarinetist who was versatile enough to find work in a number of musical styles from classical to big band, though in California he had to supplement his musical earnings by washing dishes. Meanwhile, his Indonesian-born wife, Eugenia, initially worked as a maid. Their sons, Eddie and Alex, both born in Amsterdam, had learned classical piano from the age of 6, but it was inevitable that finding themselves on the West Coast in the late 1960s that they'd be drawn to rock and roll. Eddie's staggering guitar work, his innovative technique allowed him to fire off notes and just dazzle crowds and fellow musicians with his unbelievable speed. He was inspired by the sonic innovations of Jimi Hendrix and a huge fan of Eric Clapton, along with Jimmy Page. Eddie, would patent several devices that enhanced the guitar's capabilities and became renowned for developing the two-handed tapping technique heard to dizzying effect on Eruption, which was from their debut album and one of the most famous guitar solos of all time. Van Halen was also one of the first groups to leverage the power of MTV with their steady, constant diet of music videos. They had famous ones for their songs like Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher. They really conveyed the band's larger-than-life persona. And they were boosted by Eddie's brief but sensational and memorable guitar solo in Michael Jackson's 1983 hit Beat It, in which he crammed a whole host of sounds into his 32-second solo. He played on the session for free, famously, but reaped huge dividends from the exposure it earned him regardless. Van Halen as a band radically modernized the trajectory of American metal by simultaneously making it less heavy, more melodic, less gothic, and more inclusive, which is code for, there were more female fans because metal and hard rock at that time was not exactly the most female-friendly genre as far as the fan base or the subject matter or just the general vibe around it. It was, very dark, depressed, male-oriented stagnation and, all these lyrics about war and Middle-earth and mythical gods and figures and legends. Yeah, not saying female fans, there aren't some who would connect with that, but you're not going to reach a wide audience of that. Van Halen was able to take hard rock, take metal, and make it radio friendly, and make it commercially viable, and make it so that something women would enjoy too, because it was exciting, it was thrilling, it was improvisational but catchy, and just really nice on the ears, despite the violent athletic feats that Eddie Van Halen would put on that guitar. And Joe Satriani, who's one of the greatest guitarists in his own right, said, Eddie put the smile back in rock guitar at a time when it was all getting a bit brooding. He also scared the hell out of a million guitarists around the world because he was so damn good and original. The band's first 6 albums sold 34 million copies in the United States, according to the RIAA, punctuated by the mammoth #1 single Jump in 1984 off their album 1984. That being said, they were also as much known for the music as they were for the soap opera dynamics of the band. They famously kicked or fired or someone left. Kind of, sort of a callback to the Velvet Underground, but this was much more, dramatic and drawn out. Was David Lee Roth, who was the original singer of the band. He left, I believe, in 1985 or 1986. They replaced him with Sammy Hagar, who also eventually left the band because of problems with Eddie Van Halen. Then David Lee Roth came back. Then he left again. Then he came back. Then he left again. Sammy Hagar, same deal. And Michael Anthony, the bassist, left the band as well, or was fired. It's hard to say. So they're as much known for the dysfunctional dynamics, kind of a dysfunctional family, if you will, as much as they are for the music. But as far as Eddie Van Halen himself, no one ever denied his genius as a musician. Maybe there were problems with him as a person. Maybe you took David Lee Roth's or Sammy Hagar's side in, the whole drama over the band. But as far as a musician, no one ever said Eddie Van Halen's not any good. The guy was essentially a rock god, a guitar hero. And the first question every rival guitarist asked upon hearing the first Van Halen album was, how is he making those sounds? The second tended to be, and how can I copy it? As a consequence, the 1980s were saturated with Eddie clones, all of whom tried to prove that they too could hammer on the neck of the guitar with maximum dexterity, but it never really worked for anybody else. And as far as Eddie Van Halen as a figure, he was a man full of contradictions. He was a heavy metal guitarist whose main influence was the far more sedate Eric Clapton. He was a chart-topping virtuoso who didn't enjoy listening to music, even in his car. He once said, I prefer the sound of the motor. Classically trained, but couldn't read music. He made 2 albums that were diamond certified after selling more than 10 million copies, with neither topping the charts. Despite Van Halen's debauched reputation, Eddie wasn't much of a partier. He would use alcohol and drugs to write music and not really enjoy anything else. He was a perfectionist who didn't much care about accomplishments. When making the early Van Halen albums, he would often sneak back into the studio at 4 a.m. to fix mistakes only he could hear, but he has expressed apathy about his contribution to Beat It. He consistently worked with people he didn't like David Lee Roth, Sammy Hagar, Michael Anthony. And he, again, classically trained musician who is much more famously said he didn't even know most of the lyrics to his own songs. He didn't really care about the songs themselves. He cared about the guitar. But he was classically trained, could have done anything, could have channeled it into the highest of art, but he made music that was essentially party music. And that's been used as a pejorative in some circles, that Van Halen's music is shallow and only for getting blasted in parking lots too. And that's, the public image. I wouldn't say that's completely fair. They're completely hugely influential musically, and Eddie Van Halen is just flat out one of the best technical guitarists of all time. But that sort of speaks to the contradictory nature of Eddie Van Halen himself, and you saw that in the band. He was also really the sound of the 80s version of the future. There's a famous scene in Back to the Future or Back to the Future 2, I can't remember exactly, where, they're showing someone what does the 1980s sound like, and they show them, a Van Halen solo, because they so encapsulated what the 1980s were and what the 1980s thought the world was going towards. Excitement, thrill, speed, happiness and excess. That was really defined the 80s and really defined Van Halen. And the tools that defined the mid to late 20th century, the television and the guitar, had the greatest effect on American culture. When you think of the guitar, you will think of Jimi Hendrix, and then you will think of Eddie Van Halen. And really, he sums it up and sums up his contradictory nature and Van Halen themselves when he says, being in Pasadena Community College with Alex, where all these strict jazz guys would call us musical prostitutes because we would be gigging at rock clubs every night and then stumbling into class the next day. But there is an element of music that is for the people. You make music for the people. Otherwise, just play it in your closet. And how do you reach the most people? By giving them the band that they know. To do it any other way would be selfish. A man of the people, a guitarist of the gods. Rest in peace, Eddie Van Halen. Please fire up their albums. Please fire up Eruption at the very least. That is it for the show. Thank you for tuning in. Again, please subscribe on all your podcast platforms. Please follow us on all the social media platforms. Until next time, it's been real. Godspeed.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.